Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Perspective Shift podcast. Today, we thought we would be talking about the voices that accompany all of us in our lives. Let it be the voice that drive us to do better, maybe even push ourselves beyond our limits, or the voices that could hold us back, maybe drive us to cause harm or think in a in a harmful way. Um, on that note, I'm just going to instantly ask you about what is your own experience with such voices and how would you define them for
Mm.
yourself?
So for me personally, I can't pinpoint like one voice or two voices that talk in my head. My experience in the past, like before I started the whole self improvement and becoming a better person, the dominant voice in my head was the one that was telling me to judge other people, be angry at other people. It was generally the voice that is sabotaging me, the voice that is hating on myself, hating on other people, the voice that is just it didn't drive me forward whatsoever. It was just keeping me in my place or even holding me back.
I used to call that a vengeful voice, to be honest.
Vengeful voice.
That's just to interrupt you quickly,
Sure.
because I find that name quite fitting. Vengeful, as in
But vengeful in what way? You mean vengeful?
vengeful toward either yourself or the world or life or other humans or
The
the
voice,
circumstances.
the voice that is hurt and that is trying to protect you in a bad way, maybe. Like
Something like this. You can call it like this. I used to look at it like this is the vengeful voice of the times where I probably victimized myself and had victimhood mindset, and you're accumulating this for a certain amount of time. You can become bitter and vengeful, and then that voice gets louder. And like I said, for myself, I just call it vengeful voice.
but anyway, it was like the dominant voice, that's for sure. And then when I started learning about, being a good person, helping other people, helping yourself, self love, loving other people, that's when the voice that was standing on my side, the voice that started to push me forward, uh, started to become louder. Like it was more obvious to me, and it was, for example, if I throw something on the street, like I ate something and then I threw it on the floor, and I would walk for like, I don't know, a minute. Then the voice start nagging in my head. Hey, go back and pick that up, take it to the trash. And I would say, no, I'm too lazy. I'm just gonna walk for it. But it keeps nagging until I walk back. I do that, and that voice is satisfied. I didn't have that voice in the past. I would just, do the bad thing or do the thing that is not a good behavior, I guess. And I would not think about it much. But when I became more self-aware, this voice became more obvious to me, and I listen to it more, and then it becomes stronger and stronger. But even the other voice, the one you call the vengeful voice, doesn't necessarily disappear completely. Like, just a last example, like, in the past, I would see someone on the street, I would judge them, and I would keep judging them. And now I see someone and I still judge them for the first few seconds, and then the more conscious voice uh, tells me, no, you shouldn't judge them. Maybe they are struggling, and it is not of your business. This is their life. They can do whatever they want. And then it silences the vengeful voice. You know.
Mhm.
So I think it's always like a shift between the different voices in your head.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like self awareness is definitely related to that. It's, I guess, the best way you can describe it is when you become self aware and you realize it's also related to the way you define yourself and your identity. So when you identify yourself or start defining yourself under new terms and new conditions, the voices change a little bit in the sense that the brain kind of tries to, it's sort of like the placebo per se, because you start painting that picture of yourself in the back of your head, and which is the placebo that this is what I want to be and this is who I'm going to be working to become from now on. And the brain kind of adjusts. the voices or the ideas or the way things and the thinking patterns to this painting that you put of yourself in the back of your head. And then that generates like the new voices that tend to speak up to you.
That makes sense, actually.
Because you also like when you start identifying yourself as something new and you start working on yourself, you also change your surroundings.
Technically, it's related to influence. You know,
Exactly.
Like we talked about this before.
So like when you go from someone who is, I don't know, your surroundings is, for example, just gaming every day, and you go from there to like reading books, I don't know, listening to podcasts, going into completely different surroundings and complete different kind of mind space or mind area. And then that changes because your brain is not just consuming other people that are in a similar situation than you, but your brain is consuming new knowledge that are building or getting stored up in the back of your brain, which are related to who you want to be. And then the brain kind of, at least that's how I would describe it. I'm not a neuroscientist.
No, I would say that does make sense, but also I feel like there are certain voices that I can pinpoint how they started. Like I knew the voice that was since I was a child, that I took from, you know, from my family, from the environment that I lived in, the more judgment, maybe like, you know, we grew up in a culture that's a little bit harsh. And that voice for me is more judgmental, is more not accepting, not open-minded. And it's always in my head. Whenever someone tells me something I am not used to or something that in my culture was not accepted. But then the other voice that is more open-minded, that is more starts shutting that voice down. But there are voices that I can, you know, pinpoint where they started from.
I guess, though, this is the way that I would describe it personally. That the voices in our head are usually related, if not even entirely related, to our perception of reality. But the reason why I'm saying this is it's based on a lot of people I know as well. Not everyone. It's like when we go back to the same example, you can have two people grew up in the same place, went through the exact same life, both of them end up different. You can have two people grew up in the same circumstances, exactly the same life, same culture, same everything. Both of them growing up have gotten new or different voices in their heads because one of them has perceived the world around them as such, and then they started creating their own ego or perception of the world, which in return created the voices in their head. And then the other one perceived the world in their own way, whatever way that was. And then that also reflected in their perception of the world, the way the brain worked, and the voices in their head. So it's also related to the story that we thought was self-sticking. So when we talk about the vengeful voice, for example, you could have literally many people who went through the same experience, and then there's people who go like, okay, this is what I've went through, this is what I'm going to learn from it and try to move my life or try to do what I'm supposed to do regardless. And then there's people who would go like, it feels like the world is always against me. Why is it always me? Why does it always have to be me? This and this, and over-victimize themselves. And it's just the way that you're perceiving the situation that forms who you are around the situations, which would in return, few years in the future, would create a certain voice that would react to certain things in a certain way based on the way that you perceived multiple different situations that built up that voice or that planted the seed for that voice.
That makes sense for me, but also what I wanted to say is when do these voices come is related to your emotional state, to the environment you're in. Like I notice it. There are days when I'm like, I didn't sleep well, and then, you know, someone says a joke that maybe hurted me a little bit, and then the voice that is victimizing myself starts to become stronger. Like, oh, they don't like that part of me. I'm just, you're not good enough. You are all of these different statements. But on days when I'm like, let's say more happy, more confident, I slept well, it was a better day in general, I don't get that voice. No, I actually just see the joke as is, you know what I mean? And it doesn't hurt me as much. So it also depends to the person you're talking to, where you are in this moment, your physical health, or just your mental state in general. When do these voices rise? That's my experience, at least. Maybe there are people who have more. I don't know, how would you describe your own experience when it comes to your inner voices? How different is it from mine, for example? Because we are very different people. So I'm curious, how does it work for you exactly?
For me, honestly, I guess the same as you and a lot of people, that your mental state from the day plays a huge role, just like for you and just like I would assume for a lot of people. When you get enough rest and you do the things that you've got to do, and
Basically, the basic things.
the basics things, and you're just you're opened on that day for the experience of life. I feel like that's when the voices are the quietest. And then there's the days where, like, I don't know, let it be the lack of something, let it be some bad news, let it be some external reasoning situations, anything. That's where the voices start coming in.
Sure.
And it took me a long time to be able to detach myself from these voices, to the point of when the voices come in, even if it's a good voice that's actually pushing me to doing something good or pushing me beyond my limits, sometimes I would even question that voice. Questioning that voice in the sense of, I would question where it's coming from, the motivation. But I guess the same as everyone, because I believe that everyone is the same in that regard. Everyone got their own voices, all different kind of voices, starting from the bad, ending with the good ones.
I wouldn't define them exactly as maybe bad or good. It's more complicated than that, I think.
Sure, but
Like, I think even the
What are-
bad voices, like the vengeful voice, can be useful in certain moments and where it's trying to protect you from something, especially when you're growing up. Maybe you had a traumatizing experience, and then that voice has helped you for a while to get over something. Maybe you needed to victimize yourself in that situation. Maybe I wouldn't call them necessarily bad or good. It's more like
it's just a spectrum.
yeah.
I know what you
It's a
mean.
spectrum.
But I really can't think of a good term or terminology explaining this, which is why I went with the good and bad ones. But it would be probably the most relatable for people. But regardless of this, I feel like it's necessary for us to have the voices in our heads. Absolutely. If it weren't for these voices, we wouldn't be doing a lot of things in our lives. Whether it's deciding to move on, deciding to stick up with something, deciding to commit to something, deciding to push through something or not. Sure, the voices are a double-edged sword. Just like a lot of things. You need to learn to keep them at bay. You need to learn. I try to look at things that are double-edged swords as a sword with its sheath, and you need to keep it under the sheath and under control.
You need to keep an eye on it.
Unless till the situation comes where you could use it, that's when you would pick up the sword out and use it to push yourself to a space that you want to go to. Under the voices that you can hear inside of yourself, because so far we've been talking only about the voices. I would like to be a little bit more specific about that. And by the voices, I think we're mostly talking about the most common ones, which are like ego, anxiety, fears. There's many different names.
Yeah. I think it's pretty important that most of these voices are basically telling you things that are not true. They are like a certain perception of reality that is flawed, that is not the real world. Whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's judging other people, whatever it is. Even the voices that are trying to push you, hey, I'm really good at this, I am the best. Maybe you're not. It's just the voice that is giving you the self-confidence, which is a good thing, that pushes you forward and gives you this like competition mindset, let's say. So I would say a lot of the times these voices are just building a delusion in your mind that can either stand in your way or help you. And basically, I would say it's also related to the stories that you tell yourself. Like they come from these inner voices as well. I feel like
it just took the longer way of explaining what I was gonna say.
Okay. I mean,
I was gonna say all of these voices they come from your own ego,
Mhm.
and with ego, I was gonna elaborate.
No,
but
but
you just
it
said
got perfect.
you just skipped it, and
so it got perfectly connected to
Exactly.
your point.
It all comes from the ego, whether it's a good ego, because I feel that there's a misconception about what ego overall or in general could mean,
We tend to think like, oh, your ego is just bad. You're a bad person if you have an ego.
or that your ego is too high, which is a bad thing. It's not. No, not necessarily, because I don't think there's any metrics where you can measure whether an ego is good or bad, or whether an ego is too high or too little. I feel like we all have egos, and I don't know if it's good to not have any ego in the first place. As long, maybe it's good if you can kind of detach yourself from the harmful side of ego.
I would say if you don't have an ego, you're basically not serving yourself in any way. And that's not necessarily always good.
Maybe. But going back to the ego, I feel like the misconception of how people perceive ego is what we talked about. But I feel like what people usually tend to forget is that ego literally plays, or ego can literally be around or related to everything. In the sense of something bad can happen to you, and you could genuinely be hurt from that thing. And your ego could make the pain a million times harder.
Absolutely.
Just because of your ego. And then at the same time, the ego can make it not hurtful, not like one tiny bit. So people, I believe, like, because I've talked to many people, and it's always like people misunderstand how ego could play a role in that. And they tend to either undermine or overestimate how ego could change the way they perceive the situation, and how understanding their own egos can alter a lot of things in their own lives.
I think, it starts with understanding and self-awareness. And I think ego is what shapes your identity as well. But, your image, since a few years, since I have, delved deeper in psychology and philosophy, the idea that your identity is not fixed and that I go back to the same term, a delusion in your head, or an illusion that your ego formulates from the ideas that your parents told you, your friends, that you learn from different things. And, you start to have this idea like, oh, my name is Anas. You identify yourself with your profession maybe, or the things that you like. I like to listen to this music. I like to do this. And you formulate your identity in that sense. And this is all related to your ego. How do you see yourself?
Definitely it goes with identity, especially when I feel like we cling on too much to our identities, that we start creating even more egos around it, to be honest. That in the sense of
we get too attached to it.
For sure. But like I look at it like this. Like, look, imagine that you describe yourself as someone who is not vulnerable at all, regardless of any situation. You could be in many circumstances where it's good to be vulnerable, but because of that image or that painting that you did of yourself and the ego that you've built around it, no matter what, your ego would let you be vulnerable in that moment. And that's how it is to cling on.
It's really crazy. It's like I see it as as walls that you're not being able to tear down. I notice it a lot in my experience that, I have my own identity. I have the way that I view myself, how I react in certain situations, how I shouldn't react. And then comes a situation where I feel like I don't want to react in this way, but I should, because I have always reacted in that sense. Maybe I should try to react in a different way. That is better. But it's still a struggle. Like, I mean, it goes without saying, if we're talking about ego, psychedelics have to be mentioned here, because for me personally, they were like the breakthrough to realize, and meditation as well, how my ego is just an idea and you can break it and you can change this idea. You can change this identity. You can change, just because you behaved in a way for a long time doesn't mean you will do that. You will continue to do that. It is not fixed, but when you don't have a lot of self-awareness and you are consumed with your daily life, with your identity and the things that you're doing, it becomes extremely hard to break your behavior. It takes so much time. That's why a lot of people struggle with change and self-improvement. I think it's it's a biggest reason, like our attachment to our identity. This is why it's very difficult to actually implement change. We try to stick with it for a while, but then we stop and we go back to the way we were living.
I've came up with this for between me and myself, and I've told you about it. Just so we're clear, I'm pretty sure that there's someone else out there who've talked about this before, but I've never heard of it. I've called it higher ego or the higher self. When you start working on yourself and you start changing things and you start associating the stuff that you do with the person that you want to be in the future, immediate gratification. Again, you're going back to that same concept, you start building ego around that person that you want to be. And the ego around that person, I've called it the higher ego. The reason I call it the higher ego is because for me, or the way that I described it, is that this is you, this is the person that you want to be, this is the path. Of course, it's not linear, but just for simplicity's sakes, this is you again, this is who we want to be, this is the path. And the higher ego is like the future you, staring at you from up above, trying to make sure that you stay on the right path, and pushing you when you're trying to take a day off or slack. The problem with your higher ego is that you could genuinely be on the verge of burning out and genuinely wanting to take that day off, but the higher ego doesn't get that, and it could try to push you regardless of how you're feeling or regardless of how close you are to getting burnt out. It could genuinely just push you to the point of self-sabotage.
I would say
burnout.
I would say it is just like any other part of your identity or part of your ego. You might get too attached to it.
That's true.
And I feel
that's
like
true.
We're both struggling in that sense recently, that we might be getting too attached to it sometimes, that we feel bad whenever we take a break. It always, this voice comes and tells you that, hey, you're slacking, you should be doing more. And I think I also mentioned it, like when it is like the battle between the vengeful voice and the higher ego. I'm going to call it the higher ego as well, because it makes sense, because you're trying to reach your higher self, so it is the higher ego. And it's winning more battles in my head nowadays, but I feel like I'm getting too attached to it, that whenever I get even a little bit selfish, in a sense that I had to be selfish in that moment, I still feel guilty. I still feel bad, like, hey, this is not who you wanted to be anymore. You don't want to be selfish, you don't want to judge people, but sometimes you can't go around it. You have to behave in that way, otherwise you're basically trying to protect yourself in a sense, and just you need to look out for your needs as well. But this voice is always telling me, you have to push forward, you always have to be better, you have to do everything you have to do every day, give the same effort, give the same energy, but that's just not possible. So just like any other part of your identity, you might just get too attached to it and forget that it is just another voice in your head that you just formulated with time.
I feel like in people, even me included, to be honest, in this, should be a little bit more careful with what are we building our higher egos around. Because the higher ego is going to stick up with you for a very long time, for sure. And if you build it around wrong values or wrong goals that don't align with who you are, the higher ego can definitely get you burned out. You surely know the last couple of times when I reached misalignment burnout in my life, it was related to my higher ego being built around the wrong things and the wrong values, which of course at the time I wasn't that aware of who I am and what I wanted to be and the things that I wanted to work with. So of course my higher ego was built around the wrong things, but I didn't give it much attention, and that higher ego was driving me into the wrong direction for a long time, and I was just getting out from the first burnout to go into the next burnout phase, then out of that one to go into the next one. And it took me a couple of years till I've realized that maybe it's the whole idea of what I was doing, what I was trying to achieve, that was wrong. And a had to take a complete step back and reevaluate it.
That's why you need to take step backs, as we talked about in the last episode.
Exactly.
I feel like even if, let's say, now we are building this more healthy, higher ego because we know our values more and stuff, but maybe in 10 years, our values are going to shift a little bit and our goals are going to change, but you still have to deconstruct this higher ego image that you built. So maybe it is something that is serving you now, but it's not going to serve you later. And you're going to suffer the consequence anyway. So that's why it is better to find maybe more balance, and also realize that just because you believe in things, you believe in certain things right now, doesn't mean that in the future you're going to be on the same path. Something might take you somewhere that you feel like is better for you at that point. And the voices in your head at that point are still going to be the same. You're going to try to deconstruct some voices and build other voices. And we do most of these processes subconsciously. So So the higher ego or any kind of voice might be helping us right now, but in the future it's going to stand in our way. So that's why we need to be careful whatever we are talking.
I like to look at it actually in a little bit different way. It's like I feel like you need to come to peace with the voices inside of you.
Yeah,
regardless who they are. And once you come to peace with the voices that you have, or the potential voices that you could have, and you build a good chunk of these voices around the things that you want, then you could keep most of these voices in your life. Another thing the only chances or possibilities where they could harm you is if you've taken a major turn in your life, then you've got to reevaluate and readjust. But as long as you're sticking up with what you wanted to do and sticking up with everything that you've planned for yourself, then I feel like a good chunk of these voices that you've built around these things could be a good thing to keep in your life, because it's always easy to procrastinate. It's always easy to decide to lay back, and it's always easy to say yes to everything. It's always easy to go after dopamine.
It's like the monkey voice. I call that the monkey voice. Like the voice who just
wants to listen. It's just listen to the monkey.
It's just the voice that wants to be lazy.
Exactly. It's always easier to listen to the monkey inside of you. So having these voices that are like a little bit more egoistical, that thing that you can manage it, is probably a good thing.
Yeah. Like even the monkey, it's good to give the monkey some control sometimes.
For sure. You need to enjoy life every once in a while. You can't.
I think it's like there are things in your head. There are, let's say, plants or small animals that you have to feed the whole time. If you don't feed certain voice at all, it might start shouting and screaming and really nagging in your head. So you need to feed it a little bit until it's satisfied, and then you go on to the next voice.
I don't know if that
makes sense.
But it's like
that kind of makes sense to me, to be honest. Even though it seems weird.
It seems weird.
It really sounded weird when you started describing it, but then I was like, oh wait, that actually makes sense.
Yeah.
So
because they're not gonna go away.
Yeah.
You have to take care of them.
And just like you're caring for babies.
Yeah.
If you ignore the baby for some time, they're gonna start crying and asking for attention.
And maybe at some point, a certain voice will grow up and just leave you. You never
know.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is a good point to end the podcast. I think this is a topic that is very important and also something that I really enjoy talking about. And we're probably gonna mention the inner voices and the ego in future episodes. Like this, it's not limited to what we talked about, and I'm sure that there are a lot of points that we didn't mention. So this will come up again, one way or another. And
this episode and the last episode as well were a little bit, without denial, a bit worse than the episode we've worked on so far. Not worse content wise, but quality wise. It's related to I've been ill for some time right now, and we're moving in 2 weeks. So there's a lot of things going on around here, a huge mess.
But these things, like, I would say after the couple of episodes that we are planning, things are gonna get better for sure when it comes to camera quality, sound quality, and also the whole podcast in general. But at first, I thought you were talking about the quality of the content, that, I just want to say that we are now just we're just trying to. We're not talking about our story anymore or our
We're just trying to find our rhythm.
We're talking about certain things that we find important, and we are referencing things that we've learned from our self-improvement journey, which was the original goal from that podcast. So just the first few episodes were more focused on our story, but now it's and that's how it's gonna be. Like we bring a topic that is important, whether it's psychology, philosophy, or any kind of interesting topic that can help one with their mental health, their self-improvement, the way they view things, and change their perspective on things. So yeah, we're very excited to talk about many different topics.
For sure.
Okay, so thank you for watching, and see you next time.